Her list of articles and book chapters makes fascinating reading, but it is way too long to read to you here. Her books include American Religions, a Documentary History, Women and Religion in the African Diaspora, Born Again Bodies, Flesh and Spirit in American Christianity, God's Daughters, Evangelical Women and the Power of Submission. And she is currently working on a book on the sexual revolution in Christian America. She teaches courses on religion and American history and society. I have to admit that I am so awed by anyone who has produced such an array of research and writing, plus teaching, while with her spouse managing a lively household with 3 young children. Her title tonight is Religion and Politics in U.S. History, Democracy and the Risks of Pluralism. Please welcome Marie Griffith.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. If I speak this way? Let me know, wave at me up there if you can't hear me at some point. Well, thank you so much to Ruth for that lovely introduction and also for inviting me here tonight to speak to you. It's already been fun to see familiar faces in the audience. My vision is very poor, so I'm sure there's other people I recognize out there, so come say hi afterwards. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. One of the great questions of our time, amidst growing internationalism, along with enduring global conflict, is how religion, in all of its diverse manifestations and appropriations, will shape the political future. This is a question so enormous and so daunting that it often overwhelms reasoned deliberation. Otherwise rational people can find themselves making absurd attacks on religion as a completely universally evil force. Others presume their own religious worldview to offer an unmitigated panacea to all the suffering and the warfare that depress us every time we see the news. Many versions of the famous Clash of Civilizations thesis exemplify the urgent attempt to understand, to fathom the sheer complexity of religion and politics as they intersect and collide in different ways today, and not merely to fathom this complexity, but to achieve some sense of order and control over it. The determination to remake the United States of America into a Christian nation is another expression of this desire for order and clarity, as is the heated impulse to banish all religion from the public sphere. Now, the subject of my lecture this evening is not, thankfully, the entirety of global religious and political conflict today. Rather, I want to focus on a way of reading our own nation's history that may help illumine current events somewhat more constructively and dynamically than the clash thesis or the diatribes, both for and against religion in American politics, that have gained so much media attention, particularly since the 2004 re-election of George W. Bush, which was credited, as you will recall, to evangelical and conservative Catholic values voters. And this, in turn, has spurred, as anyone knows who's ever been in a Barnes & Noble bookstore, all kinds of stuff about religion and politics in America today of greatly varying quality. The title of my talk, as Ruth noted, is Religion and Politics in U.S. History, Democracy and the Risks of Pluralism. And I hope this gives some indication both of the breadth, but also of the specificity of the story that I'm going to narrate. And this is a story that has to do with our nation's, what we might think of as the gradual catching up process with its long and ever-increasing religious diversity of our history. It is in part that catching up process to which we refer when we use a term like pluralism. Pluralism is defined in the most simple terms as a robust and positive response to that religious variety that surrounds us. And I'm going to delve more deeply into that concept of pluralism in just a few minutes. This historical trajectory inevitably has important political ramifications, although rather than spell them all out for you here myself, I hope they can be part of our discussion after the lecture. The story of American religious diversity and pluralism is not the only story we can tell about religion in U.S. history by any stretch, but it is one that is meant to help us make sense of the mosaic of American religions that is visible today, and to open up possibilities for engaging worldviews that are very different from one's own. So, to begin with the long history of American religious diversity. For centuries, America has hosted an array of complex and sometimes violent encounters among diverse people. The early colonizers certainly had different ways of dealing with Native Americans. The early Puritans, including those who wished to separate from the Church of England, as well as those who wished to dramatically reform the church on American shores, encountered and sometimes clashed with groups ranging from Native Americans and loyal Anglicans to Presbyterians, Baptists, and Quakers, among others. Somewhat later, Protestants clashed with Catholics and with Jews as well, particularly as immigration patterns later shifted. And all along the way, Protestants in America quarreled with one another about religious as well as political matters. In this latter regard, it is worth noting that, again, even within Protestantism itself as a specific tradition, the conception of the church was greatly contested. Was the church to include only those who were gathered out of the world, visible saints, as the Puritans would have it? Or was church membership to be more open, with less of a distinction to be drawn between the saved and the damned, or the temporal and the spiritual realms? This debate over the boundaries of the religious community consistently played into struggles over church and state, which you're going to cover at a later date in this term. It is sufficient to know here, though, that the ideal of a pure Christian commonwealth, immortalized in Governor John Winthrop's wondrously hopeful exhortation to his fellow Puritans in 1630, that we shall be as a city on a hill, and reinforced by a mode of empowering the male laity in church leadership and selection of the ministry, that this ideal turned out to be a formula for conflict, dissent, and rebellion in the name of purity, often enough, far more than a recipe for widespread religious and political harmony. Even as later generations of frustrated Protestants tried to work out the kinks in the Puritan system, many still hoped that a holy commonwealth that was founded on religious truth could be served by being established and by having an official position within the civil state. The establishment system, as I think you know, was one in which the civil state would require everyone to contribute to the support of the church. The civil state could also engage in punishment against heresy or blasphemy. And we tend to forget perhaps now that the case for establishment had been, at least partly, the case for truth. That there was fixed truth embodied in the church, and anything outside of this was error. And it was really the Enlightenment and Thomas Jefferson who changed the very meaning of error. That now error is a part of free inquiry, so it's a good thing. But the case for the establishment had been truth. It was also based on morality, the premise that no society can flourish without holding a set of common moral rules. If there are disagreements about these rules, this creates anarchy. Civilization itself needs such rules. And the early establishment system was also based, thirdly, on the biblically inspired notion that we are the new Israel, that God's kingdom encompasses civil society as well as the church. We're all subject to God's laws in his kingdom. Now, in this early context, of course, there were a number of countervailing ideas and forces to this establishment system in the 18th century. Perhaps the most notable, or one worth mentioning here, was immigration, which brought innumerable fragments of alternative religious communities to the New World. So you have increasing numbers of Catholics, Jews, Quakers, French Huguenots, various sects from Germany, such as Mennonites and Moravians and others. The slave trade as well, African-American slaves and ex-slaves, with their own forms of religious identity and practice from West Africa that became coupled with evangelical Christianity in particular on American shores. So all of this ethnic intermixing was hugely important for later patterns in American history. At the federal level, religious establishment was prohibited by the First Amendment to the Constitution. It was adopted after months of arguing over the precise language in 1789 and was ratified by the states in 1791. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so here we see America recognized as in some sense a religiously plural society. But at the state level, the situation was far more complicated. And as we know, the states dealt with disestablishment in a very much more uneven sort of way. Again, you'll discuss this more later, and I would only want to point here to the enormous tensions created by this complex situation regarding what we might say are the public and the private distinction, the public and private realms. This is part of what's getting worked out in all this controversy over the role of religion in this period. This difference between public and private, one might say, is basically introduced at this point, this sort of distinction that we draw. And from the perspective of some religious folks, this entails religion getting pushed to the margins because it's no longer seen as an appropriate arena for public life. If you've read some of the works by figures like Stephen L. Carter, Richard John Newhouse, other critics writing today who have criticized the utter marginalization of religion and who have tried to think of appropriate ways to bring religion back into the public sphere, you see this tension clearly persisting today. This split between public and private really being one of the tensions that persists with us throughout our nation's history. Now, of course, many religious folks don't particularly like this notion of being pushed to the margins, those who perceive it to be that way, and not everyone perceives it that way, of course. But many try to rework that position in particular ways. The evangelical reformers of the 19th century, for instance, abolitionists, women's rights activists, some of them, temperance reformers in particular, don't like this public-private distinction. And part of their rationale for working and reforming the society is based on the fact of this notion of bringing these back together and living religion in a much more public way. So the point here is to say this line between public and private spheres of our lives has ever seemed to be in motion, and often in very bewildering ways. So this is then the broader historical context of religious diversity and conflict from the very start of our history. Realities that would increase in the 18th century and still more dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries. But still, despite these internal differences and challenges from the many upstart groups that arose in the 19th and the 20th centuries, I'm thinking here of the Mormons, the Millerites, Christian Scientists, Pentecostals, just to name a few of the well-known Protestant-derived groups, a particular sort of Protestant milieu long prevailed and held what we might think of as a cultural monopoly until around the middle of the 20th century. But over the past 50 years or so, the place of Protestantism in American life has dramatically changed. Protestantism no longer holds a clear cultural monopoly as it once did. It has more recently been characterized by displacement, fragmentation, and relocation in American life. Diversity and divergence within Protestantism have been as visible as the increasing variety of religions beyond Protestantism in this period. And to paraphrase a well-worn truism by the Protestant historian Martin Marty, all we have to do to get a picture of how diverse Christians are when they address the public sphere is to mention the names of 4 of the better-known Baptists in America in recent history. And Marty names Jesse Jackson, Jesse Helms, Jerry Falwell, and Hardy Cox. Now, Falwell died recently, as some of you know, and in any case, I thought I'd try to update the list of Baptists just a bit by adding to this list Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Marion Wright Edelman, Mike Huckabee, John Grisham, did you know? And yes, Britney Spears. The only famous white female Baptist I could find, which I suppose says something. Better Britney than Ann Coulter. In recent times, the realities of rapid political, social, economic, and technological change have generated a state of affairs that we've come to call globalization. And this entails for Americans closer contact and contact with and relationships with other parts of the world. And this increased conflict, as we know, often leads to cooperation and to new alliances with other cultures, other nations, other people, but just as often fosters conflict and hostility. Now, observers and experts have had a lot to say about globalization's effects on various dimensions of American society and culture. Social scientists, for instance, have developed instruments for measuring international trade and development and their consequences for U.S. patterns of consumption and for the economy more generally, of course. The outcome for religion is no less vast, as changing demographics and modes of communication have spurred significant shifts, not only in congregational life, but in the very ways that Americans talk and think about religion. So the question is, how do we measure American religiosity in a global age? And one approach is to attend to poll numbers, which consistently show high levels of religious belief and practice across the nation, in urban, suburban, and rural areas alike. For instance, there's a very commonly cited statistic that you've probably heard before. This one comes from the General Social Survey, which biennially collects data in face-to-face interviews. And this is the fact that slightly more than 95% of all Americans claim to believe in God, according to the General Social Survey. I think the latest figure from 2004 was 95.3%. People when asked say that they believe in God. Now, other figures from the same survey also show high rates of people claiming to pray daily, to believe in life after death, and to find strength in their religion on most days or every day. Although other numbers show an equally strong skepticism toward organized religion itself. There's always this tension between one's personal practice and one's attention to organized religion. Also, just yesterday, results from a new survey of religious affiliation, some of you may have seen this, the New York Times had a short piece about it. This report was released by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. Now, I didn't see a whole lot that actually seemed new in the initial report that I saw, which had to do with religious switching, that Americans are very frequent and constant switchers from one tradition, or at least one denomination, to another. But the study does seem to show ever higher rates of religiously unaffiliated Americans, people who are not a member of an institution or don't consider themselves to have a stake there, but who nonetheless consider themselves as in some sense religious. So this is something we'll get into more in a moment. But beyond confirming what many observers already know, which is that Americans in general are quite religious, and far more so than any other modern Western nation, and serving as a kind of conversation starter for the historical study of American religion, I think it's debatable whether these numbers really say much of anything significant. Survey questions, as we know, by their very nature, lack nuance, and responses to them typically fail to capture the context that you need to understand the changing contours of our nation's religious makeup, including what people really mean when they claim to be religious and how their religious attachments change over time. And just to cite one example that may be familiar to some of you here again, you may remember David Brooks's term flexodoxy, which I think he first used in about 8 years ago in the book Bobos in Paradise. That flexodoxy was a term he got, by the way, from a rabbi in Montana. But Brooks uses this term as one that highlights the ambivalence that many Americans feel about religion. So they, in Brooks's view, they want the moral ballast and the certainty of orthodoxy, but they also insist that their orthodoxy be flexible. So they want the orthodoxy without all the rules against women, for instance, or against birth control, or just to give examples, seeing these as cultural accretions or as forms of chauvinism that are not inherent to the faith. So thus the popularity of flexodoxy. Above all, polls and survey data tell us very little about what we know to be one of the most fascinating religious realities of our time, which is, to get back to the globalization of American religion and its attendant challenges. So here's another commonly cited, but perhaps misleading statistic. This one is verified in a handful of very well-regarded quantitative studies, and it's that social scientists typically cast the percentage of Christians in the United States, including Protestants, Catholics, and a wide array of breakaway groups, as around 80% of the total population. Now, if we take this as the sole measure of religiosity, that 80% of the American population is in some sense Christian, this picture would lead us to believe that the remaining groups, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, pagans, and so forth, and certainly secularists, individually comprise only a tiny percentage of the American population. But this too will lead us astray if we take the number too literally. Surveyors themselves note that some groups are undercounted because of the fact that surveys have tended to draw in only English speakers, and not to mention the fact that many surveys are conducted over the phone. And if you're like me, you might notice a call labeled anonymous or labeled with some strange thing on your caller ID and not pick up the phone, right? So there's all kinds of sort of really things that don't go into these surveys, we know. It is also true that the high number of Christians includes countless thousands of people who haven't darkened the door of a church in years and whose affiliation is more of a cultural than a religious one. So there are good reasons for people who consider themselves Christian very strongly also to doubt and cast some suspicion or skepticism on these numbers or to think about them there. Finally, even if one does consider the survey data to be mostly accurate, the rise in numbers of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists in recent years is striking. And all observers agree that these numbers are increasing today. So we know this to be true. Now let me talk a bit about changes in the American cultural and religious landscape here. Obviously, from the historian's point of view, American religious diversity has long been underestimated. Dissenters, mystics, eclectic spiritual seekers, borrowers, and theological innovators have always comprised an important part of the American religious landscape, making up what one historian of American religion has termed the oneness and the manyness of American religion. So if by oneness we mean to suggest the traditional public role played by Protestantism in our nation's history, the social, legal, and political history, this manyness suggests the many other ways of being religious that Americans have both invented and adopted over time. We have always, in this sense, been a nation of religious seekers, one in which the spirit of independence and individualism has led to the burgeoning of new and radical, in many cases, radical religious movements, such as, again, the Mormons and the Millerites, who were later the Seventh-day Adventists. And from one small branch of the Seventh-day Adventists come the Branch Davidians. So you see all of these wild family trees there in American religious history. Oneida perfectionists and transcendentalists, Christian scientists, and New Thought meditators, positive thinkers, and many, many, many more. The sheer fact of religious multiplicity and diversity, of course, has not inspired wholesale celebration. And indeed, the thoughtful commitment to honoring and working with, rather than against, religious diversity has regularly inspired criticism from opponents who do not like this way of approaching religion. It is this commitment to engagement with religious others that advocates distinguish as pluralism. So pluralism as opposed to plurality, meaning sheer diversity of numbers. Pluralism being the sort of the commitment to deal with and engage with religious others, that this is the distinction here. And again, this has always been something of a fragile ideal that is very difficult to achieve in public or, one might say, in private life as well. But the situation of religious diversity today is more than an intensification of patterns that have been visible since the 15th or 16th century. I want to mention three major changes that have occurred in recent decades that really render the contemporary scene religiously unique. And those three factors that I want to suggest to you, and we could talk about others, of course, but one is the new immigration patterns that occurred in the wake of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And I'll return to talk about these in a moment. The second that I want to mention are the new models of interreligious encounter, cooperation, and conflict that have arisen as part of our new media culture and the vast explosion in what we think of as media and communications today. And third and finally, an increasing emphasis in many religious communities upon transnationalism and global concerns. So I want to say a bit more about these in a moment, but these three factors together create a situation that we might call religious globalization, one in which these traditions, such as Mormonism and Pentecostalism and Islam, continue to grow rapidly throughout the world. And these and other traditions also continue to multiply and to encounter one another within our own nation's borders in very complicated ways at times. So in the wake of these tidal shifts that have taken place since the 1950s, the United States stands today as something of a spiritual mirror of the world's religions. Now, to understand how much of a change this is for us today, no benchmark is more revealing, perhaps, than the best-known commentary on religion from the 1950s. And this is Will Herberg's highly influential 1955 book, Protestant Catholic Jew, an essay in American religious sociology. Herberg here offered a kind of critique of American patterns of assimilation to what he called the triple melting pot, in which religious identity gradually replaced ethnic identity for a majority of Americans. And it was also a situation, as Herberg saw it, in which conformity to what he called the American way of life was the highest norm. This is how he saw religion being characterized. It was the common religion of American society, one that blessed consumer capitalism in a certain sort of way, and that he lamented as being essentially idolatrous. Now, while Herberg's thesis had much to commend it, and arguably still does, and we hear echoes of this today, the book in no way considered alternative models of religion that were already present in the range of groups that were located beyond these borders of traditional Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish identity. Already, when Herberg was writing in the mid-1950s, Americans had encountered Hinduism, for instance, and sometimes converted to it through the figure of Swami Vivekananda, who had stayed in the United States after the 1893 World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago and had formed Vedanta societies. Many in the 1950s would also become familiar with eclectic adaptations of Zen Buddhism, as popularized by Alan Watts, Jack Kerouac, other writers of the period, beat writers and artists and others. But such movements seem to have appeared marginal to Herberg and to many other intellectuals of the time. And in that context, American appropriations of Asian religions looked like the ludicrous fringe, way, way out there. African American Protestants also did not fit Herberg's paradigm, as he acknowledged somewhat uneasily. And he did not account for black Catholics, Jews, or black Jews, or black Muslims at all. Now today, our understanding of religion in America during the 1950s, our historical understanding of religion, encompasses all of these groups, plus many others that were not considered by Herberg. And so Herberg's model for understanding religion in American life, however incisive about the kind of nationalistic thrust and the self-focused trend in American life, appears nonetheless rather limited in scope. Already brewing at the time Herberg wrote were signs of the later upheavals the later upheavals in American life that would sharply alter the complacent model of mid-century religion that Herberg, excuse me, oh, there's a frog in the throat. trouble. I've been on leave this year, not using my voice, you can tell, excuse me. The civil rights movement embodied the very opposite of religious complacency, drawing strength and inspiration from religious leaders, both black and white, whose reading of scripture and tradition undergirded not only their faith, but also their political convictions about social justice. And indeed, faith and politics were, for many, inseparable in this context. Stirred by civil rights language of identity, pride, and personhood, other liberationist movements arose around religious circles. Women resisted the gender hierarchies in their traditions and hoped to revisit and really rid their faiths of sexist prejudice. Some women stayed within the tradition in order to work for positive change, while others left to pioneer new varieties of egalitarian spiritual community. Religious homosexuals established gay caucuses within traditional institutions, as well as forming gay-friendly organizations outside of them. And just as religious feminists played an enormous, although now partly forgotten, role in the broader women's liberation movement, so did religious homosexuals help spur the larger gay rights movement that remains active and influential in our time. And it goes without saying that all of these developments within religion and politics generated reactions that were no less divided than the civil rights movement itself had aroused. So highly controversial, all of these movements there. Now, meanwhile, and somewhat out of the spotlight, other transformative changes were gradually taking place. So let me return to these that I mentioned before. Immigration. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 smoothed the way for new waves of immigrants whose movement here had long been restricted. New arrivals, particularly from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, generated an upsurge of religions that were outside the historical American mainstream. And over the course of 40 years, the numbers of Buddhists and Muslims, in particular, rose noticeably. And numbers of immigrants who are Hindu have also accelerated rapidly in recent years as well. Gradually, in major cities across the country, as well as a notable smattering of suburbs, there rose Islamic mosques, Buddhist shrines, and Hindu temples catering to growing numbers of immigrants as well as their children and their grandchildren. The acceleration of Latino immigrants has meanwhile had crucial ramifications as well, not only for American political and economic life, but also for religion. The Catholic Church in the United States has witnessed consistent growth in its Spanish-speaking membership. But so too have many Pentecostal churches. Many have grown from small storefronts to sizable megachurches. Since many Asian immigrants also profess Christianity, it is by now quite ordinary to see Protestant and Catholic church buildings hosting numerous foreign language services. These immigrant populations have had a dramatic effect on Christianity in the United States, as many practice a more fervent, charismatic form of worship than their more staid Anglo-American counterparts. Growing numbers also of African and Afro-Caribbean peoples, too, have also shifted the nation's social and religious contours, both within traditions such as Christianity and Islam, as well as outside them. African-derived religions such as Yoruba, Voodoo, Candomblé, and Rastafarianism have increasingly received exposure, even if still appearing exotic or even demonic to some onlookers. And secondly, to media, the changing media landscape. It's very clear, I think, to all of us that cable and satellite television, not to mention the internet, that all of these have generated vast changes in American religion, no less than in other parts of our culture. Websites devoted to religious evangelization or discussion, therapeutic support, and debate have all proliferated, as have catch-all sites such as BeliefNet.com. Religious themes have permeated a number of popular TV programs in recent years, and or at least a subtext in some recent Hollywood films as well. And meanwhile, spirituality drives the self-help arm of the book industry, and explicitly religious books constitute one of the most lucrative arenas of the publishing industry today. Of course, spirituality is a somewhat looser and more appealing term to many Americans today, connoting, again, greater innovation and freedom, or to critics, it connotes sloppiness and narcissism, cafeteria-style religion. Pick what you want and then leave the rest out. This is kind of the far left of flexodoxy in David Brooks' terms. Oprah Winfrey, through her extraordinarily successful media empire that she saturates with messages of spiritual empowerment, has palpably influenced religious talk outside the institutions as well as within them, and has also contributed to this growing, what we might call the commodification of spirituality. Popular culture, certainly that part that's dominated by youth, no longer considers it uncool to call yourself a religious person. And this is a dramatic change from even just the 1970s when I was growing up, the way that youth culture intersects with religion and spirituality. So we don't have any kind of simple process of secularization here at all. Rather, these changes suggest a repositioning of religious and secular categories in American culture and society. And again, they seem to suit the seeker mentality that has long been a part of our national culture. Now, finally, I want to say a word about the visible upsurge in attention to global issues in many areas of American religious life. And this goes beyond the traditional, the mission emphasis of, that was once stressed by Christian churches and is still stressed by Christian churches. But this is something different here. September 11th, of course, garnered much attention to Islam across the world. Fear and anger that respond by Osama bin Laden's violent attack, as well as the bigoted acts that were perpetrated in its wake against many U.S. Muslims, both of these things have led to intense discussion and debate about Islam. Conservative think tanks, such as the Institute on Religion and Democracy, have voiced strong critiques of liberal religion in the United States, while articulating strong support for causes such as the Iraq War and a proposed federal marriage amendment. Concern and compassion are also evident today in both conservative and religiously liberal circles, as witnessed by the widespread American religious attention to the crisis in Darfur. Darfur and the global catastrophe wreaked by AIDS. These, as we know, are situations in which the religious right, the religious left, and everything in between has a stake and broad concern. So those have been very interesting issues for scholars to try and parse out. In these and in many other global causes, American Christians and Jews have worked alongside Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, secularists, and others, who many would have once shunned, and with whom many continue to disagree theologically. So theological agreement is no longer necessarily the be-all and end-all for cooperating with another group on issues of such global import as these. So all of these changes, which I've only been able to sketch out in the most simplified of forms, point to the rapid intensification of our nation's religious multiplicity. And what I'd like to do now is to turn to pluralism at last and to focus on this question, particularly what its advocates mean when they invoke the term and encourage its practice. And I've written a few names down here on the handout that you have there so that you can know who I'm talking about here. Scholarly observers such as Diana Eck, and William R. Hutchison have developed complex and subtle models for thinking about religious pluralism in America, both historically and in the present context. Hutchison, who was a historian at Harvard until his death 2 years ago, has written of the lengthy lag time between the rise of religious diversity in American history and the more recent, perhaps, commitment, or at least the lip service paid to pluralism. So in Hutchison's words, and this is from his 2003 book, Religious Pluralism in America, The Contentious History of a Founding Ideal, Hutchison writes, Americans and their public policy are only now coming to terms, however grudgingly or opportunistically, with a radical diversification that came crashing in upon the young nation almost at the moment of its birth. Americans today, he wants to argue, don't have a choice but to respond in some way to the religious diversity surrounding them. So where Herbert was once able perhaps to ignore or truly not see groups beyond the Protestant Catholic Jew paradigm, no one can really ignore the religious diversity around them. As Diana Eck has written in her book, Encountering God, pluralism is but one of several responses to diversity and to modernity. Diversity does not have to affect me. I can observe it. I can even celebrate diversity, as the cliche goes. But I have to participate in pluralism. I can't just stand by and watch. Pluralism, Eck continues, is not simply tolerance, but also the seeking of understanding. Pluralism is not simply relativism, but it assumes real commitment on my part. In a world of religious pluralism, commitments are not checked at the door. Relativism assumes a stance of openness only. Pluralism assumes both openness and commitment. Now, for those who consider themselves to be people of faith or religious in a deep way, a question often recurs at this point. And we might put it this way. This is how Eck puts the question. Does my God hear the prayers of people of other faiths? In her book, Encountering God, Eck took this question, does my God, does our God, if we're talking about a community, does our God truly hear the prayer of people of other faiths? She took this question as the point of departure for her discussion of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. So these are the alternatives that she sets out there for religious folks. In the exclusivist view, as Eck would have it, my community, my tradition, my understanding of reality, my encounter with God, in short, is the one and only truth. And that to some degree, at some point, it excludes other points of view. As an example, in 1994, some of you may know this story, a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, Bailey Smith, said during a talk, and this was before 15,000 people at a meeting in Dallas, Texas, with all due respect to those dear people, my friend, God Almighty does not hear the prayer of a Jew. So this was the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention. This was actually a statement he had made earlier in 1980 and so forth. Now I'm going to continue that story in a moment, but just to say this is kind of the, the sort of epitome of what we mean when we say the exclusivist view. In the inclusivist view, there might be many communities, many traditions, many truths, but still, my own way of seeing things is the culmination of these in some sense. That my point of view, my religious worldview, is in some sense superior to those others, or at least wide enough to include the others under a universal canopy and defined on my terms. So if I'm an inclusivist, I would probably say, yes, my God, of course, listens to the prayers of people of other faiths, but it is God, as I understand God, who does the listening. In the pluralist view, according to Eck, truth is not the exclusive or inclusive possession of any one tradition or community, or one doesn't necessarily think that one holds the key to that. Religious diversity is not seen as a threat, but rather as, in a sense, an opportunity for energetic engagement with other points of view. It's an opportunity for the cultivation of some kind of empathic engagement with the other. However humbled we might be to realize that one never truly knows the other, just as you never truly supposed to know yourself. If I'm a pluralist, then, I would say, yes, my God is listening to the prayers of others, and I will add that I do not own the truth about God. God, in this view, is our way of speaking, a way of speaking about reality that cannot be encompassed by any one religious tradition, including our own. And so let me give an example here. After Bailey Smith's comment in 1994 that God does not hear the prayer of a Jew, a group of Baptists, called the Alliance of Baptists, broke with conservative Christian beliefs about Judaism, very explicitly. And they issued a Baptist statement on Jewish-Christian relations in 1995, which acknowledged, among other things, that the Holocaust was made possible only by centuries of Christian teaching and church-sanctioned action directed against the Jews simply because they were Jews. As Baptist Christians, they continued, we are the inheritors of, and in our turn have been the transmitters of, a theology which lays the blame for the death of Jesus at the foot of the Jews. A theology which has valued conversion over dialogue, invective over understanding, and prejudice over knowledge. They confessed then their sins of complicity, of silence, of indifference and inaction to the horrors of the Holocaust, and they asked all Baptists, they called upon all Baptists to join them in revisiting their history and rethinking this whole relation, the Jewish-Christian relation, and abandoning the traditional supersessionist concept. Jews would no longer be evangelized. So these were sincere Baptists who dissented from the one point of view. And I make that point, too, to say that I'm not demonizing Southern Baptist or any tradition as having one as really having a monopoly. I think within these different traditions you find pockets of folks from different points of view, exclusivist, inclusivist, and pluralist, at least until these things can no longer be held together under one roof. Now, Eck is an outspoken proponent, of course, of this third option. And her books, particularly her book, A New Religious America, which I've listed on that handout, How a Christian Country Has Become the World's Most Religiously Diverse Nation, these books have sold well in the popular marketplace. Scholars of religion, though, even those who share many of her sensibilities, are often ambivalent toward this vision of pluralism. They find it naive, simplistic, and not to mention impossible for persons of deep conviction, particularistic convictions, to adopt. And let me just say that students often balk at this too. My Princeton undergraduates often say that Eck's vision of pluralism appeals to them to a point, but that it absolutely seems that it can only be embraced ultimately by those who do not hold truly strong and clear convictions about truth or about God. Another critique of this model of pluralism that sometimes gets aired is that religious pluralism itself acts like a religion. That it is a viewpoint that is protective of religion, and that values, or even overvalues, empathic treatment of religions. And recently I spoke at a conference on religious pluralism. I was speaking about pluralism in American women, and another speaker there evaluated religious pluralism as, this is a quote, a framework of interpretation that rests in a universalistic and finally mystical understanding of religion and its essential importance for human existence. So because pluralism from this point of view is ultimately a ham-fisted outgrowth of liberal Protestantism, skeptics may be right to see its repressive possibilities and its potential for silencing genuine disagreement and debate. And this is what my critical students see when they see pluralism. But the proponents of pluralism vehemently dispute these critiques, and they insist that genuine pluralism is fully open to debate and disagreement. Several have argued eloquently that pluralism is a more robust conceptual commitment than its critics have allowed, that it emphatically does not imply lack of all conviction. Thinkers have pointed out that the question that faces us is not whether we will engage other religions, but how we will do that and how we will deal with competing moral commitments. And likewise, someone else to mention is the Princeton sociologist Robert Wuthnow, who in his 2005 book, America and the Challenges of Religious Diversity, and I brought this one, not because I know Bob and am hawking his book, but because I think actually this is one of the more interesting and worthwhile treatments of the topic that really gives it some complexity and is based on interviews with Americans about how they think about other religions and what they do, and it's full of the critiques of this model there too. So I commend this book to you. There he argues that genuine religious pluralism in the American context can and should move beyond wishy-washy acceptance. He cautions us against both the conservative, what he would see the conservative, the sort of knee-jerk critique of religious pluralism on the one hand, and the empty, liberal, sloppier celebration of religious diversity on the other. So this question of how to deal with religious multiplicity lives with us still, and the religious dynamism of our time, whatever forms it takes, I think will continue to require educated discussion and debate within as well as beyond the lecture hall. So I leave you with the questions that we are still investigating in our own time. Thank you.
Same survey on religion, one of the recent surveys indicated that the U.S. was the most religious country of all the developed countries. What attribute of our politics does that imply?
What do you mean, what attribute of our politics? You mean, what does that imply for our politics in a way?
Compared to the other developed.
Oh my, well, you know, there's so much talk of this. The Herber book that I mentioned may have been, John can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but may have been the first to really note that America is both the most religious and the most secular country on earth. And that's a sort of concept one hears again and again and again, although we hear less about the secular side today. But you know, what that means is both that people have drawn those public-private lines in very interesting ways. And though the point I wanted to make was how contested this is, I think the point that can be drawn from your comment is that Americans have been content, in a sense, to allow the public life and the political sphere, if not to be secular exactly, at least to be something that's more universal and generic, not necessarily needing my version of Christian faith to be the one that is legislated at the highest level. But there's no doubt that I think this is very complicated. You may have an answer implicit in the question that you're asking me about this too, to draw those comparisons.
Compared to many of the European democracies, more developed countries.
Sure. And we're so
does the
religious.
character of the political individuals lean more one way or the other because of that?
Oh, I see. Well, you know, the historical way, again, of understanding why we're so religious, I mean, one of the explanations, again, is that because earlier our ancestors allowed for the disestablishment and promoted the disestablishment of organized religion, it allowed all of this creativity and experimentation to go on underground. So part of the diversity and the experimentation has created the open marketplace for religion. Right, and that in European countries where there's been the model of the state church, the way to rebel in part was to rebel against the whole thing. There have been other models of rebellion here too, but what that does to to our political life and our notions of individualism, our Protestant history, and so many things play into that too. I don't know if I'm answering your question or even properly understanding.
I'm not sure I do. But it implies that there may be some difference in moral values.
I see.
Yes.
I think that's something that's fundamental in the political sphere, taxation and the fact that religious institutions are not taxed in this country, and implications of the multiplicity of religions, Scientology, what have you, that are able to operate under that umbrella of tax-free status in our political sphere. I'm wondering if you see a continuation in the multiplicity of religions, how that will become difficult as it interacts with circulations.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the question of how you define a religion is always with us, right? And thankfully, I'm not, a legal scholar that has to deal with this, but I think that there are wonderful books out there, including precisely where our provost, who has written very insightfully on some of these legal issues, in a couple of books really about this. But certainly, you're right that I think these perennial cases, which maybe will get talked about later on in your term with John Wilson's lecture in a few weeks. But you're absolutely right that these definitional questions are always with us, and what counts as religion, and what are we counting that is taxable or that is exempt from other forms of control and regulation.
It's fine to have the wide open territory when it stays within the sphere of religion, but when it intersects, it becomes more complicated.
How does pluralism deal with a situation that we have today where a politically dominant religious view on stem cell research inhibits scientific advance? Do you revel in that pluralism?
I asked the question. I shy away from the answers because I agree this is so deeply complicated. I mean, I'd rather open that question up. I'm sure other people would like to speak on this. Did you all hear the question? And when it comes to an issue such as stem cell research, where do we draw the line between religion and politics and religious faith in the public sphere? I mean, I absolutely think this is behind so much of the frustration that is out there in these criticisms of my religious point of view needs to be heard. I don't need to check it at the door. And I think that the sort of liberal response, whether it's a secular liberal or a religiously liberal response, is to say, well, we don't ask you to check your religion at the door, but we ask you to translate that into terms that others can understand. This is Jeffrey Stout, who I skipped over, but I think I wrote on the handout you had, Jeff Stout's Democracy and Tradition book, which really wants to make a case for that. How can religious arguments be a part of the religious sphere without taking over and without saying this is the religious point of view, and therefore, no stem cell research, no this. He's trying to find the kind of common ground, I say middle way in a sense, through that very murky territory. Oh, yes, sorry, I'm sorry.
Both of these lectures have risen in my mind about the development of human character. I mean, morality, one's own ethical base, and one's own values. And, what is the well that people draw off of? And you can look at it from a theology point of view, you can look at it from a religious point of view, but I guess what comes to mind is when I think about we want leadership. Not leadership of leading sheep following the leader, but we have leadership who represents the ideals and the values that I'd like to think we could have developed common ground on. And that really takes me back, believe it or not, to the founding fathers and founding mothers of, freedom, justice, the core. We want to think of almost any religious faith. So, to me, it's almost it can come into semantics, because do we need to know someone's religion if they are going to present a platform for really, to me, which is most important, is tolerance and justice and respect, regardless of one's absolute belief system or what group one belongs to, because a lot of religion in this country is based on social affinity that people create. So,
Yeah, no, it's a very helpful comment. I mean, it goes back to this question in a sense. I think this is what is so tricky about religious pluralism, is that often people aren't talking about deep moral commitments. You know, it's forget belief. We can deal with other people's beliefs. We can talk to them, and we can keep our own commitments. And that's not the threatening side. I think the threatening side is the moral commitments. I mean, maybe this is getting back partly to your question too. That these are about deeply felt views, whether they be about, I mean, you've mentioned leadership, about sexuality, about women's roles, about there are so many deeply held about the war. You know, what we define as our moral values also differ. And this is what, it's become a cliche now that in something called the culture wars, if such things exist, that people talk past each other. And so the moral values, what one side considers to be deep moral values, are not seen as moral values on the other side, or somehow these things can't come together. And each side translates the other side in different kinds of language. And so there's a felt lack of respect, I think, that both sides feel, and a real lack of engagement. So I hear this as the deeper problem is not engaging at that level of what is your religion? Oh, your religion, oh, that sounds nice. Well, here's my religion, and let's all get along. It's these deeply felt moral quandaries. Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
But there's an implication in the terms diversity and pluralism that there's a wide gap amongst the moral values.
Mm-hmm.
And when you begin to think about the definitions of the specific moral values of a society, they're really not that diverse in some of the other sociological issues and some of the peripheral issues that create the diversity and the pluralism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, then that's the conversation I suppose we should be having, right, to find out if that's true or not. I mean, I don't know. But in any case, I don't think that those are always the issues that do get talked about, and that, or they get yelled about, but right all the time. But maybe at that level. And this is what I think that people see the naivete in Diana Eck and some of the other models of pluralism, that they're really not getting at the heart, you know, of these kinds of things. Yeah.
You allowed in earlier our talk that 95% of the country believes in God.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a 5%
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
And with pluralism, we don't know where to take them.
Mm-hmm.
And when you pose the question, what if God, we hear the prayers of people of all the faiths?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're in that 5%, you say, well, there's no God out there that you're talking to anyway, so it doesn't matter.
So the question was posed incorrectly from that angle. Well, I think that the F model is that even if you're a secular person, of course, you could participate in this notion of pluralism if it's a secularism that has deep conviction to it. I mean, I think the only, from her point of view, or any of these folks that I'm mentioning here, those who don't engage with pluralism are just those who don't care. If you're indifferent to it all, then it's not going to be a model that even, you know, matters and hits you. But I think that she would certainly, I think, speak for a robust form of, you know, thoughtful secular commitments that is very much there. And in that sense, you're right. The God question, I mean, I pose that because it's such a stark way of thinking about it. And it gets me to Bailey Smith, which is helpful. But it's not the right question to pose, you're right, that is inclusive of all. Yes?
I want to ask you for, let's say, a forecast or a prediction, sort of on this question. You know, another face of diversity is fragmentation. Do you think that in the end, over, I don't know, periods of decades, States to much the same situation?
I'm not a prognosticator at all, but I think that the fragmentation is a real issue. I do. I mean, what can I say about that more than that, you know, my sympathies, I have my own suspicions about the pluralism model, and some of the suspicions I outlined, I share. And yet, what are we going to do if we stop talking to each other and attempting to engage, you know, with some of this religious difference? But I take it you're asking if there's so much fragmentation, for instance, along the lines of "this is my religion." Some of you may remember the book Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah and company a few years ago. And the famous piece from that sociological model was these interviewers went out to find out how Americans thought about individualism and religion being a piece of this. And they supposedly interviewed one woman whose name was Sheila, and she said, well, my religion is just my own little voice. It's my own little thing. I don't participate in a community. I don't need that. It's just mine. It's Sheila-ism, my little voice. And the point that they were making is that's the road we're going down. And talk about fragmentation. If my religion becomes Mariaism and yours is whatever, you know, then we go in that direction. I'm not so pessimistic as that. I mean, I see people struggling to forge different kinds of communities. I mean, if I would predict something, it's just that people will continue to struggle to form communities in some way. And I think that's extremely complicated and difficult in the world at the time we live in, but maybe it always has been. Yeah.
One question I have is about how pluralism came about. Sort of, because people became interested in more Eastern religions, and people would have to take a step back and say, how do we explain this? Or is it that as people began to accept the fact sort of that there is this idea of pluralism, and people then became more interested in Eastern religions, that there's sort of a broader view of deities, and is, you know, God many gods, or is he many gods, that's actually one God?
I mean, I think you could see it in both directions, right? That some people were very drawn. You know, the Jack Kerouac example is not the best example. I mean, there were groups of people just rebelling against conformity who, you know, found something meaningful or at least sort of fun and, you know, for the moment in Eastern religions. There have been other much more serious, I would say, you know, versions of that. And then as people really get to know that there are all these religions around, or you have a neighbor move in who happens to be from India, and you get interested in Hinduism, I mean, there are so many ways into that. So it's really, you know, as a model, you could say that there have long been people who were committed to engaging the neighbor on, you know, his or her terms. But many ways into it, I guess, if that's not too messy an answer to your question.
Thank you.